Today, I'm talking about a new watch from Polar, the Polar Unite. 11.78 miles, 8 minutes, 51 seconds per mile, and 143 beats per minute on a very hot run for the day. I'm in a new area now. We were in Guttenberg for the first part of the summer. Now we're in New Vienna, Iowa. Terrain's a little bit different here, even though it's only about 15, 20 miles up the road. A lot less tree cover, and the summer is getting hotter and the humidity is rising. So a very hot run for the day, but a great time to test out a new watch from Polar, the Polar Unite. Now, before I get into my detailed thoughts on this, after just a couple of runs, I do want to go over some disclosures. This is a watch that was sent to me for the purpose of review, and I've done a lot of work with Polar in the past. However, they're not paying me to make this video or to use this watch, and they're not going to get a chance to preview any of my thoughts or footage before you guys get a chance to see this video on YouTube. And just as a point of clarification, the point of the disclosures isn't to prove that I'm unbiased. I don't think anyone can be completely unbiased. The point of the disclosures is to let you know the potentials for bias that may exist in the video so that you can take that in consideration when you're evaluating the things that I have to say. So I'm just laying it all out there so that you know where I'm coming from. So with that out of the way, now let's talk about the Polar Unite. It is an entry-level watch that doesn't have GPS, but it has a lot of other great features that may make it a lot of people's first activity watch, and I think it could be a really great choice for that. It's super thin, one of the thinnest running watches that I've ever run with, and it's one of the lightest running watches that I've ever run in compared to the Polar Grit X, which is the other watch from Polar that I have been running with, and especially against the Vantage V, which is I think the heaviest watch that I've ever run with. The Polar Unite just is an absolute featherweight, but it's not skimping on battery life. I'm still getting multiple days of battery life with this thing. Now, I haven't had it for long enough to do a full battery drain test, but I'm easily going 2 days plus using activity tracking for a couple of hours each day with it. So definitely something that you can make last multiple days depending on your level of activity, and you don't have to charge it every single night, which is an important fact that I will get to later on in the video. In addition, the thing that stands out about this watch is its absolutely beautiful screen. Colors are so crisp. The blacks are nice and inky and dark, so it makes for really nice contrast, makes it very visible, easy to see in all kinds of lighting conditions. The one caveat being cameras just don't seem to be able to pick it up very well. So when I'm running, the footage that I get, it makes it look like everything's really dim. But in terms of what my eyes see, and my eyes are getting a little bit older, and I generally prefer really, really bright screens, especially when running. But I don't have any problems with the Polar Grit or the Vantage V. I definitely don't have problems with the Polar Unite because it is that much more of a high contrast, very bright screen. The downside of that beautiful screen is that they have to do some aggressive kind of power saving features to it. So it does automatically turn off. And one of the things that I found was that the motion that you use to turn it on is not as responsive as I'd like. I wish there were a way to kind of like tweak that in the settings. There isn't a way that I've seen so far, but it seems like to turn it on, I kind of have to like do this for a second, and it has to stay there for a second before it really knows that like I'm trying to look at what time it is, or look at my pace and distance information during a run. So it's a little bit of not a learning curve, but just something you have to get used to, develop a little bit of muscle memory, and then it's not an issue at all. Now let's talk about some of the drawbacks. I mentioned that there's no GPS, but it piggybacks off your phone's GPS. So here's my phone. I carry it around with me all the time, even when I'm running with the Polar Grip. Even though it has built-in GPS, it has a lot of the features that I think a premium watch should have. I'm still running with the phone anyway. One, from a safety perspective, I want to be able to make a call in case something happens to me on a run and I need some help. I need maybe someone to come pick me up. Maybe if I've turned an ankle, that kind of thing. But I also like to listen to audiobooks, music, and podcasts. And so I've been just bringing the phone with me as I've been running. So, and if that's something that applies to you or is going to be how you want to do your running, then having GPS piggybacking off the phone for your running activity watch could be an interesting option for you and help you save some bucks. This watch comes in at a retail of $150, so $149.95 US. I think about the same number, $149.95 or $149.90 euros. The other things that are limited about this watch is that there isn't a capability, as far as I can tell, to connect a foot pod to it or any other power meter. So for cycling or for running, I don't think that it can give you any power data. Watches like the Vantage V, like the Grit X, have the ability to give you power numbers from the wrist for running activities. And you can also connect a foot pod like the Stride foot pod that I like to use. That's something that you could do on those watches, those higher end watches. It's not something that's able to be done with the Polar Unite. But I think for the market that they're looking for the people that are looking at this watch, I'm not sure that they're looking at power meters right away. And so I think that that's an okay kind of like compromise that they're making there. The only other thing that I don't like about this watch is that there's only one button. It may be something for people that are like just getting into activity trackers and things like that, but I still think that there need to be more buttons. I'd like to be able to do more things in terms of interacting with it. Yes, it's a touch screen and it's very inviting to touch because of that beautiful screen and the beautiful colors that it has. But I also just don't like touching a screen that's this small. I feel like my finger gets in the way of what I'm trying to do. I'm not a huge fan of that. So with it there only being one button, it makes it a little bit harder for me to interact with and to use, especially during an activity. Now, on the other hand, there might only be one button, and that might make it harder to do certain things during an activity, like manually setting a lap. But I don't think there's a way to manually set laps on this device anyway, either through touching the screen or touching the buttons. I think that it can be set up to take auto laps every mile or kilometer or however you set it, what you want the lap intervals to be. But I don't think that there's a way on this watch to be able to like manually set a lap. Let's say you're doing intervals, you're saying you're doing like half mile intervals on the track or in the middle of a longer run. I don't think there's a way to manually set that, which I think is a mistake. I wish there were a way to do that with like a double tap or a long press or something along those lines. When you hit the one button that there is on this watch, what you do get is the ability to pause and resume. That's pretty much it. Or if you long press the one button, that will end the activity. So that's one of the ways that you can interact with it. I wish there were more buttons. I wish there were more things that I could do during the activity. You can still swipe through all the different screens and you can load up tons of different screens to show you different things like your heart rate, your distance, your lap distance, your lap pace, your overall distance, your overall pace. Lots of different ways to see the metrics of your activity during the activity. But there's certain things that I would like to do that I think are not necessarily pro level features that I think should be in this. So I hope that they can revisit that and maybe do something about it in a firmware update. So the benefits of giving up all this stuff, in addition to the price, is you're getting introductions into a lot of the things that I really like about Polar that sets it apart from some of the other companies that I've worked with. And so some of the things that I absolutely love from Polar, in addition to just I enjoy the watches, I think that the data that it gives me is useful in terms of run activity. But in terms of being able to wear it all the time, I really like the sleep tracking, and there is a heart rate monitor built in onto the watch, so you can keep track of your sleep, your heart rate during your sleep. What are your respirations like? What is your heart rate like? I think that gets all wrapped together into a rating system that Polar creates that rates how well your sleep was. And that's something that I've been using very frequently, not only to help guide it doesn't completely dictate what my training is like on a day-to-day basis, but it helps me guide it a little bit. It also has helped me make certain realizations about some of my non-running activities. I mean, everyone knows, like, if you have a heavy night of drinking on a Friday, your Saturday long run's going to be terrible. But did you know that, like, if you have a couple with dinner on Tuesday, that a Wednesday, a midweek long run might be a little bit harder or maybe a little bit more taxing on your body than you intend if you have a couple of those drinks? Not saying that you shouldn't drink at all. I still do indulge. I still do enjoy those kinds of beverages, but it helps me kind of make a little bit more informed decisions. Similarly with the sleep, I might think that I'm getting a lot of sleep, but I might not be getting quality sleep. So with this watch, it can get deep dive into, like, how much are you in deep sleep versus light sleep, how much are you in REM sleep, a lot of different kinds of ways to look at what your quality of sleep is that can help you make some decisions, not only in terms of your training, but how can you make your sleep, or the best kind of thing that you can do for your recovery, more effective. So one of the things I've always kind of noticed is that I prefer a firmer bed than a softer bed. But I've also noticed that if the bed is very soft or like very squishy, that not only do I just not feel as comfortable in it, my sleep isn't as good. And so that's something that I've realized through some of the sleep tracking features that the Polar Watch has. And that's what brings me back to the battery life on this. The fact that I don't have to charge it every night means that I can wear it while I'm sleeping, so that way I can get that really important sleep data. I've had Apple Watches before, which I think are also pretty capable running watches as well as being great just smart watches. But I would always charge them overnight, because then if I didn't, I wouldn't have any watch life to be with me during the day. And so, like, I never found like a good rhythm of how to both live with an Apple Watch and also sleep with the Apple Watch at the same time and maintain that battery life with a longer battery life, like in the Polar Unite and like in a lot of other devices like the Polar Grit, the Vantage V. That extended battery life is useful, not just from a convenience sake, but also from the perspective of it enables that sleep tracking, which I think for me is just one of the killer functions. You also get the activity tracking that you would expect from any like activity watch. So it lets you know, like, how sedentary are you, how much time are you spending walking, what are your steps. FitSpark is another part of what you get an introduction into the terms of the Polar and the Flow ecosystem. And so what that is, it tells you, like, you've been working hard the past couple of days. Do you need some more kinds of strength types of workouts to work on mobility and strengthening some other ancillary muscles? Or is it a type of day where you just need to get out there and get some cardio in? It gives you that type of guidance. So maybe you're starting to get into the fitness and you're running a couple of days a week, and now you're like, well, now what do I do? How do I get to that next step? How do I keep improving? The FitSpark is a really great way if you don't know kind of like where to begin, where to start experimenting and playing around with different kinds of activities that you can do. And it gives you instructions and like a routine to work through in case you want to start trying some of those other things that can support a more active lifestyle. So a very interesting feature as well that incorporates that heart rate data, that sleep tracking data, and looks at all of your activity data from all your other running or cycling, or any of the variety of activity. It could track like yoga, it could track treadmill running, hiking, tons of different activity types. So you could do that, and it wraps it in and gives you suggestions on what to do on the next day. So the last thing that I'll look into is how accurate is it to use the Polar Unite in terms of a training tool. So that's something that people are always concerned about, is pace and distance data. I want to make sure that if I'm training for my first 5K, 10K, or half marathon, that I have an accurate or somewhat accurate idea of like, how fast should I go out? Am I in good enough shape to be able to run those kinds of races? And so what we'll do is we'll take a look at some of the data. I've been running for the past several days with both of these watches at the same time. One of the things that I've also done is I run with both of these watches with and without external heart rate monitors attached to them. So for the runs that you're going to see now, each of these watches, the Polar Grit X and the Polar Unite, the Grit X has been paired to a foot pod, which gives pace and distance information from my feet rather than from GPS. It also still does get a GPS tracing, and I was getting heart rate data from an armband optical heart rate sensor. With the Polar Unite, what I was doing is I was using GPS from the phone. I was using then also heart rate data from a chest strap, the Polar H9, which is their entry-level chest strap. And I paired those two things together, and I was able to see data kind of from both wrists and running kind of not awkwardly, but like with two watches on for the past several days. So let's take a quick look at some of that data, and I'll show you where they're remarkably similar and there are some differences. Let's look at the run from today. So just this morning, a couple of hours ago. So Tuesday, June 30th at 6:30 in the morning. On the top, we have heart rate. That's coming from a chest strap that I was wearing. The pace is coming from GPS information from the phone, and the altitude is kind of extrapolated, just kind of like pace is extrapolated or calculated, but the altitude's coming from, I think there's pretty much like tables of, for GPS coordinates, what is the elevation. Here's the same run, but coming from the Polar Grit X, which also had the benefit of a foot pod and a different, but also an external heart rate monitor. And so what we're seeing is a pretty similar heart rate tracing. I'll do a closer examination of the heart rate tracings head to head coming up. One of the areas where I feel like I can definitely tell a difference though is in the pace. I had 4 kind of bursts of speed in this run, just 2 or 3 minute increments of some faster running. And so you could see it's a little bit cleaner. Here it is from the Polar Unite, which is getting it from GPS data from my phone. Now, if we actually look at some of the GPS tracings as well, we can see for the most part, they're pretty close. The one that's coming off of my phone versus the one that's coming off of the GPS radio in the Grit X are doing pretty good jobs of being similar. But I generally think that phone GPS is a little bit less accurate than watch-based or more dedicated GPS type devices are. And we're kind of seeing that here, although this particular screenshot is not so bad, but there are certain parts where, I mean, I'm running the same route. It's just the same watches, one on each wrist. And we could see that the GPS tracing on the Polar Unite, which is coming from my phone, gets a little bit crazy. It goes a little bit haywire as I get closer to the town area where I am here. But I'd say overall, it's doing a really good job. The difference in the distances is 0.05 kilometers over the course of about like 11, just shy of 12 miles of running for this particular day. Now let's take a look at the data from the day that we were, the video that you just saw. The darker color one is from the Polar Grit, and that's a little bit more steady and I think a better accurate representation of where exactly I ran. The Polar Unite is kind of like just kind of all over the place. I don't know why it's doing that. It's not the watch's fault. It's what my phone is doing, which my phone is an iPhone 11 Pro, and I'm not sure that there's many differences in terms of how phone GPSs perform. I've never done that test. But this one is doing kind of what I'm used to seeing when I see variations or kind of like squiggliness in the tracings from a phone GPS. Here's a little bit of a zoom in on kind of what that looks like and some of the more prominent differences. And then as we get towards town back here where my in-laws live, then we're seeing like it has me like running through the fields, which I wasn't doing, at least not on this particular day. So that gives you an idea of some of the differences that you might see when you're looking at phone GPS versus a watch with like more dedicated GPS activity happening. But I would say for me in this area, the amount of differences between those two were pretty slight. Noticeable, yeah, I mean, it affects the average pace for the run as well. I will say, however, though, my results are probably better than a lot of people's results are going to be, depending on where you run. So where I normally run in Chicago, down by the lakefront, and into downtown for a run commuting to work. In that situation, I think that the phone-based GPS is not going to be a really great option for me because it just gets interfered with all the skyscrapers, and like sometimes I'm running above grade, sometimes I'm running down by the River Rock, which is below grade. But if you're running in a suburban area or an area that's rural, like where I am now for the summer, and you're looking for a way to dip your toe into like the activity tracker or the run tracking device market, $150 is a really compelling price point. There's a lot of competition in that space though, a lot of different watches to look at. But I think that because it gives you an entry point into the Polar Flow ecosystem, which I think is a great way to start being able to understand your runs on more than just a run by run basis, I think that's really valuable as well. So pretty exciting option from Polar. If you have any questions about it, feel free to put them down in the comments down below. I'll do the best that I can to answer them myself, or if I can't, I'll try to get an answer for you. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of the video. Hopefully you guys are staying safe out there on your runs, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yo, what's going on?